Hello and welcome to the Pig Edge, Teagasc Pig podcast with me, Ciarán Carroll, bringing you all the latest news, information and advice to keep Irish pig farmers up to date. And for this episode, we're looking at the tillage sector and its interaction with the pig sector. And I'm joined by Michael Hennessy, Head of Crops at Teagasc Oak Park. And I first asked Michael, how has the tillage sector been performing over the past few years?
Well, Ciarán, it's been a difficult few years. When we look back maybe over the last 3 years, we can all remember the drought of 2018. Very difficult for farmers, and it depended on the farmer's crop mix. Some farmers got on quite poorly, especially if you had, say, spring barley and beans. There were quite poor yields of those, but where you had, I suppose, a better mix of winter cereals and spring cereals, it wasn't so bad. But it was more than made up for by the fact that prices were up, and also the fact that straw prices were up enormously. So actually, farmers did okay out of it in the main in terms of their overall income was up. Now in 2019, probably described as a relatively average year with reasonably good yields, okay kind of prices. So that was a bit of an average, if you like. In 2020, then we had the poor start in the autumn of 19. There was less winter crops out there. We then had that earlier drought in 2020 in May and June, which affected a lot of crops quite badly. So yields are back enormously kind of from where they would have been. So look, it's been very much up and down, and I suppose for tillage farmers this year, prices are only average and straw volumes are back a lot. So things are not looking great for a lot of guys, to be honest.
Okay. And in terms of this year's harvest, can you give us, some update on that with reference to maybe the yields that, for our crops that would be used by the pig sector, barley and wheat and so on?
Yeah, so look, I suppose if you look at the cereal harvest, if you like, the barley, wheat, oats, the total volumes of that in comparison to a normal year, so we're down to about 500,000 tonnes of domestic production. So, I mean, part of that factor is the switch from winter to spring, right? More a case of being forced to rather than a voluntary switch. So you had a big, winter barley acreage fell by probably 40%, whereas spring barley acreage went from about a little under 100,000 to nearly 140,000 hectares. So you had a big switch. So that had a big influence on the total volumes. But when you're to look across all of the wheats, barleys, and oats, pretty much any of those individual crops, whether they're winter or spring, there was a kind of a general reduction of yield, we think, of give or take about a tonne per hectare or 0.4 of a tonne per acre. So it's quite substantial. So I suppose then when we look at the quality of pig, which pig men would be very interested in, the quality was exceptional starting out. Amazingly, crops were thin, but the moisture came back into them up towards harvest. They filled extremely well. There was plenty of sunshine, and crops were, the good, well-filled grain. That did reduce somewhat towards the very end of the harvest, given the fact that we delayed a little bit. But in general, when it's all said and done, mixed up and dried down, quality has been pretty good.
Good to hear that. And what's this going to do now then for grain prices in Ireland? How do we see it affecting the farmers milling their own feed or the feed compounders?
Yeah, well, I suppose the guy who's milling his own thing is probably going to, there's plenty of grain out there to be got, whether it's in the general farmers that get them off of who are drying the grain for them or in the merchants. I mean, there's plenty of grain out there per se. So the availability of it is certainly going to be there, and the availability of good quality stuff is going to be there. Look, the grain price here doesn't really matter a huge amount, whether we're up or down by €1 million or down by €500,000. As you know yourself, we're dictated by world grain prices. So whatever it can be imported in here, that's generally ours. But I suppose the disturbing part about this, Ciarán, on that end of it, that generally rankers to all tillage farmers would be the fact that it's often the case that Irish grain is discounted in comparison to imported grain, which doesn't necessarily make any sort of sense at all when the quality is actually pretty much the same. But look, in terms of prices at the moment, you're looking at kind of, I suppose, the 20% moisture price of barley in around 145 plus the 5 bonus, or let's just say 150, on wheat about 170, something comparable. So it's a little bit ahead of last year, but not a whole lot. And your listeners might know that prices have rallied a bit over the last kind of, since harvest in the last kind of 3 weeks, maybe come off the heights there over the last maybe week or so. But it has hardened a little bit since harvest. And maybe for anyone listening to this, I actually on the tillage edge, and I'll give this a bit of a plug as well. We spoke to James Nolan of R&H Hall a couple of weeks ago, and we went through this in detail in terms of the markets that are out there, what is looking like for the next number of months, and where it's likely to go to.
Okay, so worth having a listen to that, the Tillage Ed podcast. In terms of the future of the tillage sector, you know, what's that looking like? And are there trends occurring that might be of interest to the pig sector or could have an impact on the pig sector?
Yeah, the trends have been, God, it depends how far back we go, but like if you to go all the way back as far as the late noughties, the tillage area has declined and declined and declined. And even over the last 10 years, we probably declined over about, or the guts of about 15%. Now that's kind of stabilized a little bit. And I suppose what was really happening was, well, probably two factors. One, that the smaller growers were probably being shaken out of the system because they weren't either getting to a stage where they had no successors and they were getting out of the business, or they were just too small to keep going. However, the other factor involved in it, probably more serious than it really, is that the dairy sector has been expanding quite aggressively in the southeast and up towards the Midlands as well. And a lot of that ground has actually come out of tillage area. So there's been a lot of conversions in that. And I suppose the fact that give or take 40% of tillage land is rented. A lot of that tillage ground that would have been rented is now going into these longer term leases back into the dairy industry. And in fairness, tillage is a low margin business. Dairying is a much higher margin business on a per acre basis. And it's very hard for tillage guys to compete with that. So with the result, that has put pressure on the total amount of ground that's available out there. So, but I suppose from the other side of it, the people who are left in the tillage side of it, they are becoming more specialized, more and more, I suppose, as the years go by, and they're becoming more and more professional. And I suppose the fact that they have to get really good yields, no more than anybody involved in the pig sector. If they're not getting good yields, they are not going to stay at it, and they just can't afford to stay at it. And tillage farmers are no different in that regard. So the guys who are left, I suppose, are going to produce really good grain, which is always a good thing, for that to be delivered back into the pig sector.
Excellent. And just moving on then to other crops, I suppose, apart from the barleys and the wheats and so on, are there other crops grown in Ireland that the pig sector could be looking at?
There are, I suppose, look, there's, apart from wheat and barley, there are a certain amount of beans grown, which are fava beans. The tonnages aren't huge. There's no point in saying they are, and it's probably still quite small in overall terms, something maybe between, depending on the year, 50 to 70,000 tons. So it's relatively small in the overall scheme of things. Peas are even less. I mean, they're actually quite a small crop, and most of it actually goes towards the canning end of it, or into specific rations, probably into calf rations more so than into pigs. That being said, as you might know, there's interesting trials going on in the UK whereby beans are quite suitable for pig feed, because I think their constituents as regards the particular constituents, I suppose, of the grain are suitable for pigs, and there's a number of trials over there which have shown that you can include reasonable amounts into the ration, and they tend to do well on them as well as other feeds. So I suppose that's kind of something that perhaps the pig industry could look at, just in terms of maybe of which the Irish industry is looking for the kind of the all-Irish ration, if you like. The other one, Ciarán, is rye. Not something that was grown hugely in Ireland for the last, probably 30 or 40 years, probably for the big reason that it tended to sprout and fall over a bit. However, the new hybrid ryes that are out there at the moment are gaining a bit of traction at the moment. They seem to be more stable, a bit more robust, and they might be able to fill a slot in a tillage rotation where barley mightn't do as well. And as you know, they are particularly, it's a good feed for pigs. And I think we have some work from the Moore Park herd showing that pigs do quite well on it. I don't know all the ins and outs, but I think it does reasonably well on it. So look, there is more opportunities out there, and we have a merchant in the southeast, Collins down there, trying to assemble a tonnage of rye for some pig producers locally. So that'll be kind of coming to fruition next year. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Good, yeah, and we've some new research I think coming out from Peter Lawler on rye as well, which we'll be hearing about in future podcasts. In terms of the nutrients required by the tillage crops, pig slurry is obviously a valuable fertiliser. What's the interest in pig slurry from tillage farmers like?
Well, I suppose, look, from a tillage farmer point of view, a lot of tillage ground tends to be in or has been in tillage for a long space of time now. There's probably less rotations back into grass. We don't have sugar beet, so there's less opportunities to build organic matter in lots of these tillage soils. So tillage farmers then have to look at other ways to get organic manures, and obviously pig slurry is one of those. Certainly not the only one, but it is one of those. Now, certainly from looking at the pig side of the house, it is very valuable in the sense that it's relatively high in P and relatively high in K. Its only kind of drawback really is, well, two. One is that it's low dry matter material for the most part, and it, so in other words, it doesn't have a huge amount of P and K in it. And the availability of the nitrogen component, it's high available, which is great in one sense, but not very good of when you can actually get out to spread some of this material onto easily, if you like, onto tillage ground. So realistically, on terms of after harvest, the only crop you could argue that it's really good for is the likes of oilseed rape, because that has a capacity to take up nitrogen before the end of the year, whereas cereals don't really require it, and not such a great practice putting on that kind of material at that time of the year because the nitrogen tends to be lost. So it's really best for spring to try and get most of it applied then, and you get much better utilization of it. And it's something I think if we're to look towards Denmark and various other different countries in Europe, they would show us, I suppose, that where we can apply it into a crop or onto a crop, if you like, during the springtime, such as winter crops, that's the way to go if we can. So that's something that I think we should, as a country, be looking at more. And that's, I suppose, assuming we can get over some of the transport problems.
Okay. And along with that, then, are there any other barriers maybe that prevent the use of more pig slurry on tillage farms, or what can the pig sector do to promote the use of slurry as a fertiliser?
Yeah, like I say, I mean, there's two big ones, I think, for us. One is the fact that it's a bulky material. Like, it doesn't travel terribly well, or terribly far, maybe is probably the way to put it. So, I don't know whether the barrier necessarily is more than 10 or 12 miles away from where it's produced. So that kind of limits how far it can go. So, I mean, obviously, there's if we can manage to get rid of some of the water out of it, it would be great. So looking at that would be an excellent way of doing it. But perhaps there's other ways of doing it. Transport can be done where you have decent kind of feeder tanks at the side of fields, mobile feeder tanks, if you like. There's certainly TAMS grants out there at the moment for tillage farmers to build sheds, or to build tanks, I should say, on their farms. But look, I can't see too many people doing that. It's too expensive. So we've got to come up with a better way of doing it. And I think there's a bit of cooperation maybe needed between the on one side, the pig farmer, on the other side, the tillage farmer, and maybe in the middle, the contractor who might have or might be able to purchase this equipment to be able to, use it over a number of farms over a longer space of time to give a bigger window for the application of slurry.
Okay, very good. And then just recently there was the Crops 2030 strategy was produced. Can you tell us a bit about that and what it entailed for the tillage sector and what it's about?
Yeah, it's so the Crops 2030 strategy is I suppose it's just a strategic plan for the tillage industry over the next 10 years. It was produced by a group of farmers and industry people who are connected to Teagasc, as in that they are our tillage stakeholder consultative group. So they took it upon themselves back in 2012 to produce something similar, because there's very little mention of tillage in the Department of Ag food harvest document. So once that was produced, we certainly, the tillage and industry got, I suppose, more inclusion in those documents, and we got certainly more traction and more recognition that the tillage industry is an important industry there. So this is, if you like, building on that in a big way. And what it tries to do, I suppose, is it tries to, do a number of things, really outline a number of really important facts about the industry that were probably easy to gloss over, given the fact that arguably a huge trust of interest in whether it's policymakers, environmental or production policymakers, tend to look at the dairy side of the house and tend to look at the beef side of the house. And maybe no more than yourselves, we were getting very little, I suppose, credit for what we could do on our side of it. So it very much highlighted the sustainability credits or credentials of the industry in terms of how low a carbon emitter it actually is, and how efficiently the industry uses nutrients such as P and such as phosphate and nitrogen. So it tries to do that, but also, looks at some of the other sustainability bits in terms of the for the mainstream enterprises. Tillage is just behind dairy in terms of income on a per labor unit basis. Certainly a good bit behind in terms of on a per hectare basis, but on a per labor unit basis, which is really the important metric. We're very competitive, and way more competitive than the likes of beef or sheep or most of the other industries there. So we were trying to highlight those, and the group, I suppose, really came up with a little over 50 recommendations of where the tillage industry could be developed and contribute to the food industry for human consumption, for the drinks industry there, of which, as you know, we're big exporters of whiskey, in the feed one, again, such as into yourselves in the pig industry and the ruminant industry, and also the bioenergy and nutrient recycling. So I suppose the document, the thrust of it would show that the tillage industry is a big industry, has a huge contribution to make, and as the document says, can actually help other industries get themselves out of a bind, really, in terms of the environmental side of things, and also, dare I say it, in the tricky space that some of them are in terms of their sustainability credentials.
Okay, yeah. And on that then, like, what opportunities does it highlight in terms of how the tillage and pig sector maybe could work more closely together for the benefit of both?
Yeah, so what it does really is it tries to, I suppose, highlight the places where, if you like, this circular economy is probably being bandied around quite a bit, but really there very much is a circular economy type scenario for the pig and the tillage industries. And that's to say there's quite a lot of farmers involved in this already, and it wouldn't be any great news to some of the pig farmers and tillage farmers out there, but it's something that can be built upon, whereby obviously the tillage farmer can produce grain to into the pig industry and direct transport, if you like, straight to it, being one of these, I suppose, hyper-local, as they might call them, circular economies. And then on the far side, the organic manures coming back the other side. The organic manures, well used, will help to push down the total CO2 balance of the whole system, making everything more efficient from the point of view of nitrogen, phosphate, carbon, and also then helping to trap a bit more carbon into the tillage soils, making that more resilient. So, I mean, it has benefits and win-wins all around. So I suppose that's the very biggest one that we're looking at. And it's not the same I've mentioned before in terms of trying to, the indigenous supply of Irish cereals, supporting, I suppose, the brand Ireland image that's there, or the image that what we produce comes from Ireland. That would certainly all help in that direction.
Okay, and with regards to the nutrient recycling, just a little bit more on that, what does the strategy suggest in terms of any other opportunities to increase the use of pig slurry on tillage farms?
Well, I suppose look, it's an expensive process. You and I know that. You don't cart pig slurry down the road for nothing. It costs a good bit of money, and as I said already, it's one of those kind of things that it just has a transport distance of where it's going to go, and it's not going to go much further than that. So we need to try and investigate how we separate some of the waters from it. So we transport something that's a bit more nutrient dense. But we also then need to do a bit of work in terms of the applying organic materials to tillage ground, and how that affects the biodiversity, how it affects the long-term sustainability, and how it can increase the amount of carbon capture, all of which would potentially enable more payments to tillage farmers, and thus making the whole thing a bit easier. And if there's more money in the system, it's easier for everybody to do that kind of thing. So look, that's some of the kind of the biggest ones that's there, really, but there's certainly more opportunities there.
Excellent. That's great. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for joining us today.
No problem at all.
That's it for the latest episode of The Pig Edge, and my thanks to Michael Hennessy for joining me on the show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss a show. And for more farming information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Ciarán Carroll and thanks for listening.